Thank you. Thank you, Sonali and Blaze and Bob. Those are certainly three of the journalists I admire and respect most in the United States. So I'm very touched. And I'm always touched to speak in a church, despite my own troubled relationship with the Presbyterian Church. I was a Presbyterian seminarian at Harvard, but felt, as my father, who was, as Bob said, a minister, that I was called to write rather than lead a congregation. And when I graduated, you're approved for ordination before you go to seminary. I had to meet with my committee and tell them what my call was, and in order to be ordained. And I remember when the committee asked me what my call was, I told them I was going to go to Central America as a freelance reporter and cover the war in El Salvador. There was a long silence, and the head of the committee said, "We don't ordain journalists." So that was the end of my relationship with the Presbyterian Church. And I think in some ways it must have been somewhat painful for my dad to watch me go that far in the ministry and then finally not follow his vocation. But as Bob said, he certainly gave me a moral grounding. And he himself was pushed out of the church, not because of the civil rights movement or even the anti-war movement, but because of the gay rights movement. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay, and my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. And at that point, he had a church in Syracuse, and when he found out there was no gay and lesbian organization at Colgate, where I was an undergraduate, an hour away, he brought the gay speakers to the campus. And this led, as Bob said, after several meetings with groups of students, with gay activists, to students confiding in my father that they were too uncomfortable forming a gay and lesbian organization. So my father came and told me I had to found it, which I did. But I tell that story because his outspokenness for gender equality, it became apparent that he was finished in the church. And he did this amazing thing. He refused to back down, and it was the lesson that fortified me years later with the New York Times. And instead of bowing to that pressure, one Easter, he announced that he was holding a public Easter service for all GBTL in the city of Syracuse. And he came and got me at Colgate because he told me that it'd probably be the last time I heard him preach. And he got up and he said, "Marriage is a sacrament. It is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that refuses to honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian." And everything I do is by the standard that he set. This book that Joe Sacco and I don't know how many of you know Joe's work. We met in Bosnia in 1995 when I was covering the war for the New York Times. And Joe was working on his book, A Safe Area, Garage. And I'm not, or was not, particularly literate in graphic novels, but I certainly understood a brilliant journalist when I saw one. We subsequently did a long piece for Harper's out of the refugee camp in Gaza called Han Yunis, and then later a piece for The Nation on Camden. And as I was, the books have a kind of natural progression. I had done a book called Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, about how we have unplugged ourselves from reality, the self-delusion of American culture, the lies we tell ourselves about ourselves, the magical thinking that reality is never an impediment to what we desire, followed by a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which looked at the pillars of the liberal establishment and how they have all collapsed. The book focuses quite a bit on World War I because it was a seminal moment in American history when the corporate or capitalist elite understood that they had to break movements, radical, progressive, popular movements that were threatening their hold on power. Before World War I, of course, we had 70 socialist mayors. Eugene Debs in 1912 polled 900,000 or 6% of the vote. Some of the most widely read publications in the country, including Appeal to Reason, were socialist publications. We have the Wobblies, the old CIO, figures like Mother Jones, Big Bill Haywood, Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams. And what happened, and I think the echoes of what happened have reverberated down to today, is that Wilson, led by Walter Lippmann, a sort of grand inquisitor of the American intellectual class, understood by employing the investigations into crowd psychology by figures like Le Bon Trotter and Sigmund Freud, that people were not moved by fact or reason. They were moved by the manipulation of emotion, what Lippmann calls manufacturing consent. That's where Herman and Chomsky get the title of their book on the press from. And so they set up the Creel Commission, or the Committee for Public Information, which churns out this sophisticated propaganda, its own film division in Hollywood, making films like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin, speakers bureaus, its own news bureaus that every day are churning out pro-war stories. And when you read Bourne and you read Addams, one of the undercurrents of despair is how easily the intellectual class are seduced into the war effort, which is precisely what Lippmann understood. And those recalcitrant figures, like Debs, are eventually imprisoned. So they only have to use the Espionage Act or the Sedition Act for those marginal figures who retain their intellectual and personal integrity. And there's a writer that I like very much, Dwight MacDonald, not read a lot anymore. He ran a magazine called Politics after the war, and if any of you know Chomsky's history, Chomsky credits his political awakening to that magazine, Politics, which published Orwell, Bettelheim, Hannah Arendt, and others. But MacDonald, when he looks back at that period, says that populist movements, radical movements, the war was the rock on which they were broken. And immediately after the war, the members of the Committee for Public Information head straight to Wall Street and start working for corporations to upend traditional American values of thrift, self-effacement, and replace it with a cult of the self and with the installation of consumption as a kind of inner compulsion. And I think today when we speak about American culture, what we're really speaking about is corporate culture. And at the same time, the dreaded Hun became the dreaded red. And we entered what MacDonald calls the kind of psychosis of permanent war, that constant search for the internal and the external enemy. And as MacDonald points out, none of the political theorists, including Karl Marx, anticipated the psychosis of permanent war, which MacDonald says has the capacity to get the masses to call for their own enslavement. Now, the destruction of these radical and progressive movements, which was finally culminated after World War II with the House Un-American Affairs activity, thousands of university professors, high school teachers, social workers. It used to be that social workers advocated the unions on behalf of their clients, artists, directors, writers, musicians, journalists, like I.F. Stone, who becomes a pariah, cannot even get a job at The Nation magazine and starts I.F. Stone's Weekly in the basement, are pushed out of the system. The radical movements are destroyed, dismantled, and liberal institutions are effectively disemboweled. Now, the liberal class was never designed to be the political left. And as Howard Zinn does a wonderful job of sort of laying this out in the People's History of the United States, but all of the openings or correctives to American democracy came through movements that never achieved political power. The Liberty Party that fought for slavery, the suffragists who fought for women's rights, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. The liberal class made incremental or piecemeal reform possible. It functioned as a kind of safety valve. And when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. That's what a liberal class is designed to do. Chomsky makes this point, constantly, and he's correct. They set the parameters by which acceptable debate, and of course, you're never allowed to challenge the virtues of the ruling class. So if there's a retrospective on the Vietnam War, then we didn't anticipate the insurgency, or if there's a retrospect on the Iraq War, it's the same kind of language. But to remain within the parameters of the establishable class is not to challenge the motives of the power elite. And when there are legitimate grievances, to ameliorate those grievances enough to maintain control. When the liberal class breaks down, and this is a constant theme in Dostoevsky. It's what Demons is about, his novel Demons. It's what Notes from Underground is about. Mouseman in Notes from Underground is the figure who went to all the Obama rallies and chanted, "Yes, we can," and has now retreated into cynicism and disgust. And when that liberal center doesn't work, when that safety valve doesn't work, you enter, in Dostoevsky's words, an age of moral nihilism. That political paralysis, which of course characterizes our political system, is exceedingly dangerous. And so after writing The Death of the Liberal Class and Empire of Illusion, it seemed that the natural progression was to walk into those pockets or zones of the country that were sacrificed first to the marketplace, to corporate capitalism, that were made to kneel before the mania for profit, because they went first and we're going next. There are no impediments left. There is no mechanism within the formal structures of power to ameliorate the suffering and injustices that are being visited on tens of millions of Americans. The harvesting of the country, in essence. The breakdown of liberalism, the destruction of populist movements, gave birth to the faux liberalism embraced by a figure like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. So Clinton, who continues to speak in that traditional feel your pain language of liberalism, pushes through NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948, which made it extremely difficult to organize. As Bob mentioned, he destroyed welfare. He deregulated the FCC. That's not a small action because it allowed roughly a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel to buy up the airwaves. And I think both Bob and I have watched in the parameters of our own career, the walls narrow in terms of the range of acceptable opinion. It's all become like Dorothy Parker's comment about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. She said it goes from A to B. Well, that's sort of where we are. And you can watch the court gossip being spun one way on Fox News, and you can watch the court gossip being spun another way on MSNBC, but it's the same garbage. It's Newt's moon colonies or Ann Romney's horse, but it's not real. It doesn't deal with the fundamental issues that are affecting your lives and mine. And I knew that one of the most important elements in writing this book was to make these people visible because the wider society has rendered them invisible. And that's why I wanted Sacco to come and draw. And every time we did an interview that had tremendous emotional punch, I always knew Joe was going to draw it out, because with those comic panels, he can give it a kind of filmic quality. We began the book in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, a Lakota reservation, because that's where the whole demented project of imperialism and capitalist exploitation and expansion began, at the expense of human life and at the expense of the natural world. What happens with unfettered or unregulated capitalism is that they have the capacity to commodify everything. In that sense, Marx was right. Unfettered capitalism is a revolutionary force. Karl Polanyi writes about this in his great book, The Great Transformation, 1944. He actually uses the word sacred. He said, although he's an economist, he said, when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when nothing has an intrinsic value, but everything is relegated to a monetary value, then you exploit both human beings and the natural world until exhaustion or collapse. And this is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. The same forces that have commodified human beings are commodifying the air, the water, the land, in this mania for profit. But I think what happened in the Western Plains, and of course it had happened earlier with the Pequots and the Narragansetts and other tribes on the east, is not just the seizure of land and the seizure of resources, not just violence or this demented belief that one can regenerate themselves through violence, not just the enrichment of the railroad barons or the gold speculators or the timber merchants, but it was as important, I think, to destroy another ethic, another communal relationship, another way of dealing with each other and dealing with the natural world. And I don't think it's accidental that Marx and Engels, when they begin to formulate communism, rely on Morgan's great study of the Iroquois Indians. Because people who hoard within native societies goods and things for themselves are detested. Everything is shared communally. There's an understanding that the natural world is as sacred as human life itself. And those who essentially colonized our country were unique that way in the sense that we colonized ourselves before we, unlike Europe, before we then went on to carry on the same kind of expansion, the same template into the Philippines and Cuba, and of course today into Iraq and Afghanistan, is that whole sort of notion of no limits, of constant exploitation, and this leap, sort of from one place to another, has now resulted in essentially those forces being turned back in on us. That these people went first, but of course now we're next. We went from Pine Ridge into Camden, New Jersey. Camden is the poorest city in the United States per capita, and always one or two in terms of the most dangerous. Here you see what happens when corporations, of course, are allowed to pull manufacturing out of the country. It's not accidental that huge percentages of those within Camden are cycled through the incarceration, through the prison system, essentially making it impossible for them to escape or get out of these internal colonies where they are trapped. And they all know that when they get out of prison, if there is a job, and there aren't any jobs in Camden, but if there is any kind of employment, the first box, or the box that employers will always check, is the box they have to check off saying that they were a convicted felon, making it virtually impossible for them to escape. I teach in a prison in New Jersey, and I do that for a couple reasons. One of the most important is that, and I think that was the beauty of the last 2 years of this book, is that I don't want this sort of struggle for justice to become an abstraction. I always want it to have a human face. I don't think there's anything wrong with anger. When you see what we've done to the vulnerable and the poor, I don't know how you can not be angry. Augustine said that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. And when you are, I've taught 3 classes there now. The last one was using Leon Litwack's great works, After the Storm and Trouble in Mind, on Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and how these people have never been taught their own history. We were sitting in the class and going through the chapter about the slaveholders and the extent to which they had raped black women. Even Mary Chestnut in her diary talks about going to plantations and seeing a few dozen mulattoes running around. And of course, what's so venal is that these slaveholders would then literally sell their own children into slavery. And one of the inmates raises their hand and goes, "Well, is that why some of us are light-skinned?" And I sat in that class with most of these men are in their 20s, and for the first time they had to grapple with the fact that some of them had slaveholders' blood running through there. The class I taught before that was, on the prison form, told them it was American history, which I knew was generic enough to get me in there. And then I went and bought Zinn's Equal History of the United States for every inmate. And I'd be going through Zinn. I've never met Zinn, to my great regret, and I've always admired him. But after teaching his book to African American inmates, I realized this guy's a saint. Because I'd give 90-minute talks around Zen, and I'd hear the inmates going, damn, we've been lied to. But I think that contact, and I think that's something that, drove Joe and I forward in this book, the fact that the oppressed are not abstractions, that physical, that personal relationship carrying on a kind of individual level is extremely important for those of us who care about resistance. Because you can't walk out of that prison. To walk out of that prison and not to fight back is to betray those people you care about. The third chapter is on southern West Virginia. I'm sure you're all aware of mountaintop removal, but it's quite another thing to see it. And here you have coal companies, because they don't want to dig down for the coal, blowing the top 400 feet off of mountains and leaving behind a wasteland. We flew over the Appalachians, and it will make you sick. Hundreds of thousands of acres of moonscape. After they blow off the tops of these mountains, they use some of the largest earth-moving machinery on the planet, 25-story drag lines, gigantic bulldozers, to push all of the trees and topsoil over the edge so they can expose the coal seams, and then they burn it. So you fly over the Appalachians, which are the lungs of the eastern seaboard, provide the headwaters for much of the eastern seaboard, and it's barren rock, stripped coal seams, and burning forests. And you go down into the hollows, and you can go into villages where everybody's had their gallbladder removed because the water's so toxic. Cancer is an epidemic. You walk into the elementary schools in the nurse's office, and there are rows of little inhalers for the children. Giant billions of gallons of toxic sludge, heavy metals, impoundments that often break. It is willful suicide. It's Easter Island writ large. And yet, in the name of profit, these coal companies have the capacity to destroy life within that sacrifice zone. And of course, once they're finished there, that sort of heavy thud of the Leviathan just continues to cannibalize what's left. We, as we drove through southern West Virginia, felt we were back in Bosnia. This corporate assault is violence. And you would go into old coal camps like Jenkin Jones, and all you would see are the charred remains of houses with spindly chimneys, one after the other. And we found in every single place we went that people coped usually in two ways. One, through religion, and not necessarily Christian religion. In the Pine Ridge, it was sweats and Lakota traditions and the Sundance. We went to a Sundance, which was deeply moving. 4 days of fasting. These guys, a lot with their prison tattoos hanging on by their fingertips. And the other was into substance abuse. 80% alcoholism rate estimated on Pine Ridge. The average life expectancy on Pine Ridge is 48 for a male. It's the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. At any one time on Pine Ridge, 60% of the dwellings have neither electricity or water. And in southern West Virginia, it's Oxycontin, hillbilly heroin. There are people we interviewed in the book who a few weeks later, although they were in their 30s, were dead of overdoses. They take staggering amounts of opiates. And that's just the way they want it. People are essentially reduced in these sacrifice loans to a point of powerlessness. And yet, in every place we went, including West Virginia, there are these figures. We went to the memorial service for Judy Bonds. There are these figures who rise up. They have a very cold understanding of power. They can even sort of explain to you how hopeless it all is, and yet they find it within themselves to resist. Hannah Arendt has a great line. She said, "Never trust those who say I shouldn't or I oughtn't. Only trust those who say I can't." And all throughout the book are dotted these amazingly heroic figures. This African-American woman in Camden, Lolly Davis, who I think by the time she had done raised something like 19 neighborhood children, all on her own. Suffered tremendously. Her fiancé was shot in a bar fight, father of her 3 children, and killed. She lost her little 7-year-old girl to an asthma attack because they couldn't get medicine. I remember asking Lolly, how do you keep doing it? How do you keep going? And she said, I keep going because I never ask why. The 4th chapter is out of Immokalee, Florida, where the produce pickers, undocumented workers, and as Bernie Sanders said, in the vast race to the bottom that is America, Immokalee is the bottom. And slavery has been existent in Florida for generations, including long after emancipation. It just got another name. It was called convict leasing. And in fact, conditions were worse because in the turpentine camps and in the fields, since they didn't think they owned the convict, the survival rate was worse than if you had actually been a slave. Very few of those convicts actually finished their sentences. We don't actually know the numbers that were killed. And of course, what happened is at harvest time or when they needed labor, they would go in, arrest African Americans on the trumped up charge of vagrancy, chain them up, and send them out to work. And they were kept in place through the terror of lynching. So it's not new, but the current class, underclass, are mostly Mexicans and Central Americans who are in this reconfiguration, sort of the perfect corporate employee. They have no benefits, no legal rights. When they're not paid, there's sort of a cobble of 3 families in Immokalee that own these dilapidated trailer parks, and they fill each trailer, all of which should be condemned. I mean, rats and roaches and holes in them, with 20 workers who pay $50 cash a week to sleep there. And if they can't earn that 50, they all go at 4 in the morning to these central points where they're picked up by the buses, and Joe and I were there and then went out to the fields with them. If they can't get that 50 a week, then they're literally sleeping under the mango trees on the side of the road. We walked back into encampments where 20, 30 workers just slept every night and then would wake up before dawn and go to the parking lots to try and get work. And not surprisingly, there are persistent uncoverings of slave operations, where workers are held against their will, often behind barbed wire. Their families are threatened back in Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, if they report to the authorities, and we interviewed some of them. And that's where we're headed. That is what corporate or unfettered, unregulated corporate power will do. And Barack Obama and the Democratic Party are not going to save you from it. When we wrote this book, it was always called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, but the revolt was conjecture. We understood that with all impediments lifted, corporations would continue to roll forward until there was some kind of backlash. And we have seen just in the last few weeks that heavy thud forward. The decision not to continue to pay unemployment benefits to hundreds of thousands of Americans, which means that many will lose their homes. The assault, courtesy of our Supreme Court, on public sector unions, the refusal to fund or provide the adequate funding for food stamps, and 6 million people in this country's sole source of income now are food stamps. There's nothing left. There's no mechanism now by which we can be protected. And if you sat in a briefing in the National Security Council, their analysis, I don't think, would be much different from mine, except they wouldn't be telling you to revolt. And you can see it by how they're rapidly rewriting the legal system to criminalize all dissent. What Immanuel did in Chicago, and I think you could say that the Obama administration has actually been worse on civil liberties than Cory Cook. Not only has this administration refused to restore habeas corpus, not only has it radically interpreted the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the president the right to assassinate American citizens, and 2 weeks later, their 16-year-old son. Not only have they supported and Obama voted for the FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution is illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of Americans. And we now know all our personal information is being stored out in a supercomputer in Utah. But Obama, on New Year's, signed into law Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which I sued him for. I sued him and we won. Section 1021 permits the U.S. government to seize an American citizen on American soil who they deem is a terrorist or has complicity with what they call associated forces, not sure what that is, strip them of due process, hold them in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies, until, in the language of this section, the end of hostilities, which is in an age of permanent war forever. And this was a bipartisan bill. It was sponsored by Carl Levin and John McCain when Dianne Feinstein proposed inserting into the language an exemption for American citizens. Both the Obama White House and the Democratic Party refused to do so. They're certainly preparing for a reaction, and they're going to get one. I and Joe didn't know what was coming. We didn't know what the backlash would be. We didn't know what it would look like. We didn't know how it would manifest itself. We didn't know where it would appear. And then September 17th, Zuccotti Park. And we saw, through the Occupy movement, the first national discourse about the reality of our political and our economic system. We saw a movement that, and I'm not blind to the struggles within the movement or how they lost control of the park, or the fact that consensus became very unwieldy when we had thousands of people in Zuccotti, but was determined to include every voice. And it was fascinating to watch the response of the state and all the courtiers on the airwaves who work for the state, work for corporations. And they kept saying, "What are your demands? Just tell us your demands." The demand was fundamentally clear. We intend to reverse the corporate coup d'etat that has taken place in our country and seize power from the hands of corporations and return it to the citizenry. That's our demand. When Crane Brinton writes his great study of revolutions, Anatomy of a Revolution, which I just reread, he ticks off the elements that create successful revolt, all of which we have amply fulfilled. And in the last sort of crucial element that he cites, it is that all revolutionary movements make a fundamental demand that the power elite can never comply with because it would mean their own dissolution. For me, the most telling moment of where we are occurred when there was a coordinated effort to shut down, to physically erase, to eradicate those encampments. Now, if you read Krugman's column, he's constantly calling for a rational economic policy. We were both on Democracy Now! And Paul was on After I, and after we finished, I said, well, yes, you're exactly right, but you can only have a rational policy if you have a rational form of government. And when they decided to knock down those encampments, they exposed their hand. Because a rational response to the suffering in this country, an understanding of how to mitigate the deep and legitimate rage and sense of betrayal that is rippling out across this country, would at a minimum include a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of all student debt, and Medicaid for all Americans. It's always the ruling elites who determine the parameters of revolt. And I've covered insurgencies and revolutions and uprisings around the globe. Most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic, the first, and the second Palestinian uprising, intifadas. And these movements have a mysterious life force that even the purported leaders of the movements don't understand. On November 9th, 1989, I was in Leipzig with the leaders of the East German opposition. This was the most efficient police state in Eastern Europe and maybe the world, the Stasi state. For every 63 East Germans, there was a police informant. I was with the leaders of the opposition, and they said, maybe within a year, we will have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. Leipzig, which was the epicenter of the opposition, began with a few Lutheran pastors and their congregants carrying out candlelight vigils in the streets, a few dozen, a couple hundred, and then suddenly it erupts in September with 70,000 people in the street. And Erich Honecker, been in power, the communist leader in East Germany for 18 years, sends down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. And when the officers go in to collect the paratroopers, they find them weeping because they have mothers, fathers, friends on the streets. And when that paratroop division arrives in Leipzig, it never opens fire, and Honecker lasts another week in office. This is the power, as Havel says in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerlessness. This is the power of truth when it is expressed in the face of corrupt and autocratic power. And that truth has the power to severely weaken the pillars of power itself. The reason that I have been, and Blaise alluded to this, so critical of the Black Bloc is that the Occupy movement is a mainstream movement. That is its power. And the goal of the state is to demonize that movement, cut it off from the mainstream, and funnel its energy back into a dead political system, which is what Van Jones and Rebuild the Dream is about. When you express that truth, you draw elements within that power structure to your side. Civil servants, police. I gave a talk in New York, and I was had spoken earlier at an Occupy event, and was constantly calling for respect for the blue uniform police, although they often didn't show us respect. And I noted that the demeanor of the police changed when the white-shirted officers came. If you look at the YouTube videos, most of the egregious violence is actually carried out by the white shirts. So I gave a talk a few weeks later, and afterwards, a man came up to me and he said, "Stop attacking the white shirts because I am one. And I agree with everything you say." When we were arrested in front of the White House, Veterans for Peace and Code Pink, a couple years ago, very moving December day, snowfall, Watermelon Slim plays taps on his harmonica. They folded these veterans, many in their old fatigues, folded the flag that had been on the coffin of a boy who had come back from Afghanistan a week before. Somebody beat a drum. Silence. We walked through the snow to the fence. Many people were weeping. 133 of us were arrested. And it turns out that most of the Washington, D.C. police had been in the Guard and had been to Iraq and Afghanistan. And as they would put the plastic cuffs on our wrists, they would whisper, "Keep doing what you're doing because these wars stink." The most powerful weapon we have is our powerlessness, our transparency, and our capacity to speak truth. And that is why they are so frightened of us. And that is why the state has employed both external and internal resources to destroy us. When I was in Prague, I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel and Dinsbier, Klaus, all the people who would run Czechoslovakia after the fall of communism. And on the streets of Prague were posters of a young Charles University student named Jan Panic, who, to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, had gone to Wenceslas Square and lit himself on fire. He died 4 days later of his burns. Of course, no mention on state media. He was a non-person. The thousands of university students who accompanied his body to the cemetery were broken up by the police, and when his grave became a shrine, the communist authorities dug up his body, cremated it, gave the ashes to his mother, and forbade her from reburying them. And yet his picture was everywhere. And 2 weeks after the fall of communism, 10,000 people gathered in Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Panic Square. I was in Wenceslas Square with 500,000 Czechs when Marta Kubashaya walked out on a balcony. She had been one of maybe Czechoslovakia's most famous singer, who had, in 1968, sung an anthem of defiance that was broadcast over the airwaves until the pro-Soviet forces came, removed Dubček, and installed a pro-Soviet regime. Her recording stock was destroyed. She was never broadcast over the airwaves, and she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. She walked out that December night, began to sing that anthem, and every single Czech in that crowd knew every word. I was just in Zuccotti Park a few days ago with Father Daniel Berrigan, who is 92. And as Berrigan says, we are called to do the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then we have to let it go. Faith is the belief that it goes somewhere, even if all the empirical evidence around us seems to say otherwise. The Buddhists call it karma. It is this belief that the good draws the good. And I'd like to close with a little passage that I wrote after I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs. Faces appeared to me moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows, a pathetic collection of middle-aged fraternity and sorority members. They were not the faces of the blue uniformed police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind, the small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon learned in business schools and on trading floors effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us was filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship for money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. And it is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Short Hills, New Jersey, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow, analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity to justify their privilege, and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules. They make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture, epitomized by Goldman Sachs, has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody, and for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, and rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum: if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion, as Socrates said, that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not who say, "This is wrong," or "This should not be done," but those who say, "I can't." The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember, because they have never given thought to the matter. And without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves, so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs. Traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make that journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day and come to me in the dark. They force me to remember. They make me choose sides. There were times when I entered the ring as a boxer and knew, as did the spectators, that I was woefully mismatched. Ringers, experienced boxers in need of a tune-up or a little practice, would go to the clubs where semi-pros fought, lie about their long professional fight records, and toy with us. Those fights became about something other than winning. They became about dignity and self-respect. You fought to say something about who you were as a human being. These bouts were punishing, physically brutal, and demoralizing. You would get knocked down and stagger back up. You would reel backward from a blow that felt like a cement block. You would taste your blood on your lips. Your vision would blur. Your ribs, the back of your neck, and your abdomen would ache. Your legs felt like lead. But the longer you held on, the more the crowd turned in your favor. No one, not even you, thought you could win. But then, every once in a while, the ringer would get overconfident. He would get careless. And you would find deep within yourself some new burst of energy, some untapped strength, and when the fury of the dispossessed bring him down. I have not put on a pair of boxing gloves for 30 years, but I feel this twinge of euphoria again in my stomach, this utter certainty that the impossible is possible, the realization that the mighty can fall. Thank you.